Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Following a disappointing performance in Britain's local elections, the Labour Party is dealing with a major internal rift, with over 80 MPs calling for incumbent Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer to resign. So far, the party leader has staved off calls to step down, but the ongoing crisis paints a picture of discontent and instability within Britain's ruling party. Starmer's troubles are part of a bigger picture of establishment parties being under intense pressure from a rising wave of populism. Well, joining us here today to talk about this and more is Garvan Walshe, CEO at Article 7 Intelligence for Democrats. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So for those who are not following Britain's politics very closely on a day-to-day basis, can you give us a brief recap on how did we actually reach this threshold? Because the questions concerning Keir Starmer's government were not really making the headlines as of late. All of a sudden, we've got more than 80 members of the party saying they don't really care about his leadership anymore. So what happened?
So the Labour Party won the last election with a huge parliamentary majority of about 180 seats. It looked very dominant, but it won these elections on a very low share of the vote. So Starmer was always vulnerable, and he's been challenged very strongly on the right by Reform, which is a successor to Nigel Farage's UKIP party, and then on the left by a resurgent Green party. So he's kind of trapped in the middle. He has pressure from both sides. The Conservatives have collapsed as well, but now he's facing the same problems the Conservatives had and is finding it very difficult to position himself in a way that attracts voters. In addition, there are a lot of criticisms about his personal style. People say that he lacks charisma, he lacks the ability to talk to ordinary people in a charming and convincing way, and he also seems to lack the ability to make decisions about personnel. He's lost several chiefs of staff, several senior advisors. He is under pressure both inside and outside the party.
So now, at first glance, and comparing to other countries that faced government crises recently, that doesn't seem to be quite as bad. I mean, some of them were literally having problems with paying off, the national debt. The public finances were in tatters. How about in the UK? Is the public financial situation reasonably stable, or is it enough to actually cause a wave of discontent which could sweep away this government in the future general election?
There are concerns about the Labour government's fiscal position, but they're not nearly as serious as the concerns that attended Liz Truss's. She was a Conservative Prime Minister, but only lasted 42 days because of concerns the markets had.
Oh, the infamous lettuce test. People probably remember that, don't they? The infamous lettuce test.
The lettuce test, exactly. And I think one of the newspapers has brought out another lettuce for Starmer to see if he will last longer than this lettuce. We'll have to see. The Labour Party has a different structure to the Conservatives. They're less keen on removing leaders than the Tories were, but he is in a pretty tough position. And he's in a bizarre situation because today is the time of the year when the government announces its legislative programme for the coming year. But very few people think that he will survive that coming year. So there's a certain air of unreality about what's known as the King's speech in Parliament this afternoon.
But again, just to make it clear for people who are not really following politics in the United Kingdom very closely. The king usually tends to, the monarch generally, will usually distance himself or herself from day-to-day politics. It's not like we have a president from one political group and the prime minister from another, and you can get like some sort of open conflict there. This is going to be much more subtle if there is going to be any mention of this at all, right?
Oh, no, the king will just read out the speech. It's a ceremonial occasion. What's important is that this is supposed to be the time when the government announces its legislative programme, and that is assumed to be a place where it can set the agenda. But given the weakness of Starmer following the local election results, it's going to be difficult to do that. If the local election results were repeated, it would be likely that Nigel Farage's Reform, the populist right, would actually lead the next British government. That's why Labour are in such a state of anxiety at the moment.
Is this a realistic prospect? We're seeing that in other countries as well. France, Germany, the incumbent or generally establishment parties are facing difficulties. They're facing pressure from the far right or in some cases the far left.
Yeah, and in Britain, is like in France, Britain faces pressure from both the far right and the far left. So Labour is trapped in the middle, and Keir Starmer seems unable to seize the initiative back and actually set the agenda himself. He has rivals within the party, including Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham, who might be the most likely person to succeed him if he can get back into Parliament. One of his rivals, Wes Streeting, who is from the right of the Labour Party, is meeting him this morning, and they're going to have discussions. Whether Streeting will tell Starmer to resign is an interesting question. We don't know yet, but I see you've got Streeting up on the screen there. That's exactly him. He's one of the most ambitious young MPs. This mightn't be the best time for him because the Labour left is looking for reassurance, and he tends to come from the other wing of the party.
But would you say that perhaps the Labour Party in general is going to look at this situation and say, well, perhaps we need a charismatic leader to actually carry our message forward, to try and challenge, both the far right and the far left, rather than just, wait for the whole thing to show more cracks and begin to collapse in the long term? And would they actually say, well, we need a new leader for that?
That's certainly what supporters of Andy Burnham, the Manchester mayor, are hinting. There are other people like Ed Miliband is also interested in challenging him, though whether he's a charismatic leader is another question. Ed Miliband lost to David Cameron in 2015 and was one of the things that started the whole Brexit process in the UK, because the Conservatives then had to hold their referendum. There is a pressure for a new figure, a new force. The question is whether the Labour Party can find such a person and whether such a person can actually then succeed as a charismatic leader. Burnham is probably the figure most likely to fill that role, but there are other people, whether it's Streeting, whether it's Angela Rayner, who is involved in a bit of a dispute with the tax authorities at the moment, or whether it's Ed Miliband, who could come back and try and steady the Labour ship.
So what about the formal side of things? In some governments, generally, some political systems in continental Europe, we have a very fixed way of going about things. We have a vote of no confidence. You have a minimum threshold, tends to be a qualified majority. Then the government collapses. A new one is given the mission to, begin, a new prime minister given the mission to begin forming a government. Then it is, has to obtain parliamentary approval and all that. In the UK, it tends to be a bit more interesting, from what I remember, in that there are no fixed rules as such, and instead it often depends on how a given situation is handled by the given leader. And then again, there is the political maneuvering there. Can you explain this? Because it does actually strike many people as something surprising, like, oh, there is no fixed procedure there, and instead you have to look at past examples and think, okay, so is it going to be similar, or is it going to be totally different from what was before?
So there are two separate sets of rules. One is the parliamentary one, the other one is the party one. The parliamentary rules are whoever can command a majority of the House of Commons can become Prime Minister. And in practice, because the Labour Party has a huge majority, then it means the Labour Party rules are what matters. Labour Party rules are very complicated. It's quite difficult to remove a sitting Prime Minister by the formal process. You need another challenger. 81 members currently need to submit that challenge, and then that person goes against the Prime Minister in an election. Labour MPs don't have the power to remove their leader. This has to go to a vote of the members. So it's a long, cumbersome process. Under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, MPs actually voted to remove him, but he stayed on. It's really going to be a question of informal pressure. So if you see a number of important cabinet ministers resigning, then Starmer would have to conclude that he would need to go. But in the absence of that, he's going to try and stick on as long as possible, even if that might damage the Labour Party's prospects in the medium term.
So a few of them have already resigned, right? And we have the 80 MPs already saying they do not support Keir Starmer. Thing is, are they going to vote for one specific person, or are these just 80 people who are sharing their discontent, but not the idea of who should lead the party?
Yeah, particularly because many of these people want to vote for Andy Burnham, who is currently not in Parliament, so can't stand. They have to get him into Parliament first and then vote for him. So Starmer is banking on that to prevent this challenge materializing into like a concrete challenge by Burnham. Supporters of Streeting, for example, won't want to support Burnham. They're interested in having this wrapped up before Burnham can get into Parliament, whereas supporters of Burnham will want to get Burnham back into Parliament through a by-election. There's a special election in somewhere in the northwest of England where Burnham is from, and then that would allow him to challenge for leadership of the Labour Party. At the moment, he's mayor of Manchester, which means he's not allowed to become leader of the Labour Party. The leader of the Labour Party would have to be someone from the Parliament. And at the moment, the committee that decides whether people can stand as Labour candidates for Parliament is controlled by, guess who, Keir Starmer.
So, looking at the situation in Europe in a more general way, we've already mentioned the question of the rise of populism in certain countries. It's easy to make a sweeping generalization that this is a wave that is somehow unstoppable. You also have countries like Hungary, where a populist government, which was in power for a very long time, was toppled through a general election. So, would you say that perhaps this is, like a case-by-case basis in these countries? And also, could this be reversed even where the polls are actually unfavorable for the incumbent, like in Germany, for example?
I mean, it's a difficult time for incumbents. Prices are rising. There's global instability. The economies of the world aren't in great shape. So there's always an opportunity to challenge them. There has been a resurging trend of the populist right, and also a certain amount of pressure on the populist left, and a certain desire just to kind of, bash the system. That's why in Britain you saw people switching from Reform to the Greens. In Greece, Alexis Tsipras, who used to be a hard left Greek prime minister, is thinking of starting a new party, and this is taking votes, according to the polls, away from far-right Greek parties. So there seems to be an anti-system mode. Magyar Péter in Hungary actually was able to seize on that anti-system mode in order to remove Orbán, and he was able to do it by energetic campaigning, going around the country, having charisma. These are not new tactics in politics. If you have a charismatic leader who shows energy, who is able to talk to the people, they're generally going to do quite well, regardless of the overall situation. You see that with Mamdani in New York as much as you see it with Magyar in Hungary, even though they are very different types of politician and have very different political views. What you're seeing is that it pays to get out there, get known, have energy, and be able to convince people that you are the person to deal with their concerns and to represent them. This is politics as old as politics has been. There's nothing new here, but it's surprising sometimes how incumbents can forget this. And Keir Starmer is a classic example of the other kind of politician, who's more of a sort of civil servant who happened to be elected than an actual guy who can go around and you can't see him talking in market squares or giving speeches. He's unable to do that. Another British Prime Minister, John Major, was able to revive his fortunes in 1992 by doing that kind of retail politics. Everyone thought he was going to lose, but he pulled off a surprise victory because of that.
Garvan Walshe was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much.
I'm Jonasz. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.